For millions of Americans, the name John Denver immediately brings to mind open highways, snow-covered mountains, golden sunsets, acoustic guitar, and a warm voice singing about home. During the 1970s, songs like Take Me Home, Country Roads, Rocky Mountain High, Annie's Song, and Sunshine on My Shoulders became part of the American soundtrack. Denver seemed to represent a simpler America, a country of family, nature, freedom, and peaceful escapes from the pressures of everyday life. But behind that comforting image was a far more complicated man. His life included extraordinary success, family conflict, ambition, personal mistakes, environmental activism, international travel, aviation, and an almost lifelong search for somewhere he could truly belong. John Denver's story is therefore much more than the story of a folk singer who became a superstar. It is the story of a man who transformed his experiences, dreams, failures, and longing for home into music that would eventually become part of America's cultural identity. Long before the world knew him as John Denver, he was Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., the son of a military family. His father served in the U.S. Air Force, and that career meant the family moved frequently. For young John, childhood was defined by constant change. Schools changed, neighborhoods changed, friendships came and went, and the idea of having one permanent hometown was difficult to hold on to. But there was one thing that could travel with him wherever the family went: music. When John was 11, he received his grandmother's guitar. At first, it was simply a gift, but it gradually became much more important. He took guitar lessons, sang in a boys' choir, and discovered that music gave him a way to express feelings that were difficult to communicate in ordinary conversation. The guitar became a source of stability in a childhood where almost everything else seemed temporary. As Denver grew older, music became increasingly important, but his relationship with his father remained complicated. The strictness associated with military life and the difficulty of forming an emotional connection with his father left a lasting impression. John wanted to make his own decisions and create an identity separate from the expectations surrounding him. At one point, his restlessness became so strong that he made an impulsive attempt to leave home and traveled to California to stay with relatives. His father eventually brought him back, but the episode revealed something that would remain central to Denver's personality. He wanted independence. He wanted to decide what his future would look like. In 1963, at about 20 years old, he left college and moved to Los Angeles. He entered a competitive folk music scene filled with young performers hoping to make their names. Denver had no guarantee of success. He had a guitar, determination, and the belief that music could become his future. His transformation from Henry Deutschendorf Jr. into John Denver was itself part of his search for identity. The original name did not seem to him like the ideal name for a performer, and friends encouraged him to choose something more suitable for the stage. He chose Denver, inspired by Colorado. The decision became symbolic. A young man who had spent his childhood moving from place to place was beginning to create a sense of home through his identity. Soon, another major opportunity arrived. Denver was chosen from hundreds of hopeful musicians to become the lead singer of the Mitchell Trio. The group gave him professional experience and allowed him to perform before real audiences while developing his skills as a singer and musician. More importantly, it placed him directly inside the American folk revival, a movement that was giving acoustic musicians and songwriters a powerful platform. While performing with the Mitchell Trio, Denver's personal life was also developing. He met Annie Martell, and the two eventually married during the mid-1960s. Denver was now trying to balance marriage with an increasingly demanding music career. But being part of a group was not enough for him. He wanted to write his own songs, record his own material, and eventually stand on stage under his own name. When the Mitchell Trio ended, Denver faced a major test. Without the group around him, he had to prove that audiences would come specifically to hear John Denver. He began recording and promoting his own music, gradually building the foundation for the solo career that would eventually make him one of America's most recognizable entertainers. One of his most important early achievements came through songwriting. Denver had written Leaving on a Jet Plane, and although he had not yet become a major solo star, another group helped make the song famous. Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded it, and their version became their only #1 hit. The success established Denver as a serious songwriter even before his own career reached its peak. Producer Milton Oken also became an important figure in Denver's development and helped his music reach a wider audience. Denver was slowly moving from the world of struggling folk performers into the professional recording business. But the timing was not necessarily easy. By the late 1960s, American popular music was increasingly dominated by rock, political protest, and a rebellious new generation. Denver's acoustic guitar, gentle voice, and clean-cut appearance could seem almost out of place in a culture that was becoming louder and more confrontational. Then, in 1969, RCA Records signed Denver, and his album Rhymes and Reasons helped establish his solo recording career. But he still needed the song that would turn him from a respected musician into a household name. That song came through Take Me Home, Country Roads, written by Bill Danoff, Taffy Nivert, and Denver. When American audiences heard it, something changed. The song was not simply another successful recording. It captured an emotional idea that almost everyone could understand: the desire to return home. Its imagery of roads, mountains, memories, and familiar places resonated deeply with listeners. For a man whose childhood had been shaped by constant relocation, the idea of home carried a particularly powerful meaning. Country Roads eventually became strongly associated with West Virginia and was later recognized as an official state song. Denver had taken the simple idea of going home and transformed it into one of the most recognizable musical images in American culture. Colorado became equally important to Denver's public identity. The Rocky Mountains represented freedom, peace, belonging, and a connection with nature. Denver eventually settled in Aspen with his family, and Colorado became inseparable from his career. Songs including Rocky Mountain High, Sunshine on My Shoulders, Any Song, and Back Home Again helped push him beyond the boundaries of traditional folk music. He became a crossover artist, whose songs could appeal to country listeners, pop audiences, and adult contemporary fans. By the middle of the 1970s, John Denver was no longer the young musician searching for a stage. He had become one of the biggest recording artists in America. But fame brought its own complications. Denver's music often sounded peaceful, yet the America surrounding him was anything but peaceful. The Vietnam era had divided the nation, and political protests, cultural arguments, and generational conflict were reshaping American society. Denver's songs were not always directly political, but his growing interest in peace, environmental protection, and humanitarian causes gave his career a larger purpose. He increasingly used his celebrity to speak about issues he cared about. His identity became connected not only with music, but also with nature and the belief that people could treat each other and the planet with greater compassion. At a time when American culture could feel angry and divided, Denver offered another message: slow down, appreciate the natural world, and remember the importance of human connection. Yet the peaceful image audiences saw on stage did not mean Denver's private life was equally peaceful. His marriage to Annie Martell gradually became strained under the pressure of fame. Their relationship had inspired Annie's Song, one of Denver's most famous romantic compositions. But the reality behind the music was considerably more complicated. Denver spent enormous amounts of time traveling, recording, performing, and appearing in public. His celebrity affected the entire family. Eventually, the marriage could not survive. The story behind Annie's Song is one of the most striking examples of the difference between a song and real life. Denver wrote the song during an emotionally intense period in his marriage. While riding a ski lift toward the top of Aspen Mountain, he was overwhelmed by the scenery and the emotions he was experiencing. The mountain's colors, movement, and his feelings seemed to come together at once. He later described the song as arriving almost completely formed, and he wrote it down soon afterward. The result was a deeply romantic composition that became one of his biggest hits. To listeners, it sounded like a simple declaration of love. But life continued after the song was written, and the relationship that inspired it eventually deteriorated. The song preserved one emotional moment, but it could not determine the future of the marriage. Denver and Martell also struggled to have children and eventually adopted 2 children, Zachary and Anna Kate. From the outside, the family appeared to represent the life associated with Denver's music: a successful father, a family, and a beautiful home surrounded by Colorado's landscape. Behind that public picture, however, the marriage was increasingly troubled. By the early 1980s, the relationship reached its breaking point, and the couple divorced in 1982 after roughly 15 years together. Years later, Denver became unusually open about the darker aspects of his private life. In his 1994 autobiography, Take Me Home, he discussed his relationships, career, mistakes, and difficult personal experiences. Among the most disturbing revelations were admissions concerning infidelity and episodes of domestic violence during the collapse of his first marriage. Those revelations were difficult to reconcile with the gentle and wholesome image that many fans had created around him. His songs celebrated love, family, and tenderness, yet his private behavior had contributed to serious personal damage. Acknowledging those failures did not erase the harm, but it became part of the more complicated truth of his life. The end of the marriage also produced a bizarre and revealing moment during the division of their property. Accounts in the source material described Denver becoming enraged during the process and using a chainsaw to cut their marital bed apart so that the two could each have a portion of it. The image seems almost impossible to reconcile with the singer-Americans associated with peaceful mountains and country roads. Yet that contradiction is exactly what makes the episode significant. It demonstrated how much anger and resentment had entered a relationship that had once inspired one of the most famous love songs in American music. The collapse of his marriage was only one of Denver's struggles. His public image had become so powerful that it was difficult for audiences to separate the real man from the character they expected him to be. He was supposed to be wholesome, optimistic, gentle, and positive. Critics sometimes mocked that image, especially during an era when rock music represented rebellion and cultural change. Denver's enormous success made him an easy target for people who considered his sincerity old-fashioned or excessive. But beneath the famous smile was a man dealing with insecurity, disappointment, mistakes, and the emotional pressure of celebrity. Searching for answers, Denver became involved with EST, or Earhart Seminars Training, a controversial personal development program that became prominent during the 1970s. The seminars were intense and confrontational, encouraging participants to examine their understanding of themselves and their personal responsibility. Denver's involvement reflected something important about his life. Professional success had not solved his personal problems. He had achieved the level of fame that many musicians dream about, but he was still looking for deeper understanding and control. The public saw a superstar. Denver was still trying to understand the person beneath the public identity. Then came another painful loss. In 1982, the same year his marriage ended, Denver's father died unexpectedly. Their relationship had never been easy. His father's military career had shaped his childhood, and his strict personality had influenced Denver's ideas about family and authority. The loss added another layer of grief to an already turbulent period. By this point, the simple image of John Denver as a carefree singer beneath the Colorado sky could no longer tell the whole story. He had experienced enormous success, but he had also faced marital failure, personal mistakes, criticism, family loss, and the emotional consequences of celebrity. His story had become larger than the music itself. It was about the difference between the life an artist creates through songs and the private reality behind the microphone. Denver's music continued to sound peaceful because it focused on the things he valued most: nature, family, freedom, love, home, and belonging. Yet his own life was often far more turbulent than those melodies suggested. Instead of retreating from life, however, Denver continued moving forward and exploring new interests. His environmental and humanitarian work became increasingly important. He also developed a strong interest in aviation. Denver was an experienced pilot and aviation enthusiast who collected vintage aircraft and became fascinated by exploration and technology. His curiosity even brought him close to the possibility of spaceflight. According to the source material, he passed NASA physical and mental examinations connected with a potential civilian role involving the Space Shuttle Challenger. The possibility of America's gentle folk singer becoming a civilian astronaut reveals just how adventurous and unconventional Denver could be. His humanitarian interests also took him far beyond the United States. During the Cold War, in 1986, Denver performed in the Soviet Union, an unusual step for an American entertainer at the time. The following year, he returned for a benefit concert connected with the Chernobyl disaster. His belief that music could bring people together extended beyond national borders. In 1992, he became the first Western artist to perform a multi-city tour of mainland China. These experiences revealed another side of Denver, someone curious about the world and willing to cross political and cultural boundaries in the belief that music could create connections where politics often failed. By the 1990s, however, the music industry had changed dramatically. The genres and performers dominating radio were different from those of Denver's peak years, and the cultural environment of the 1970s seemed increasingly distant. Denver was no longer at the center of American popular music, as he had been during his superstar years. But he continued recording, performing, traveling, and supporting causes that mattered to him. He also continued exploring environmentalism, humanitarian work, aviation, photography, and international travel. Music remained central to his identity, but it was no longer the only thing that defined him. Then, in October 1997, John Denver's life came to a sudden end. He was piloting an experimental aircraft off the coast of California when the plane crashed. He was only 53 years old. The news was shocking because Denver's public identity had always been associated with life, nature, optimism, and the beauty of the world. His death abruptly ended a career spanning more than 3 decades. He left behind his children and family, but he also left behind something far larger, a collection of songs that had already become part of American cultural memory. Death did not end John Denver's influence. In many ways, it strengthened it. His songs continued appearing in movies, television, concerts, public events, family gatherings, and road trips. Take Me Home, Country Roads became more than a successful song from the 1970s. It became a cultural symbol of home. Even people who had never lived in West Virginia could connect with its emotional message. The song created a picture of a place people wanted to return to, whether that place existed in physical reality, personal memory, or imagination. Rocky Mountain High became deeply associated with Colorado as well, further strengthening Denver's connection with the American landscape. Perhaps the most unusual part of his legacy is that his songs became official state songs in both West Virginia and Colorado. That gave Denver a rare position in American music history. His music became connected not simply with individual listeners, but with the identities of entire states. Mountains, country roads, rivers, open skies, and home became permanent parts of the musical language he left behind. But John Denver's story remains fascinating because the man behind the famous image was never as simple as the image suggested. He was a military child who spent his youth moving from place to place. He was a young guitarist who left college and moved to Los Angeles because he believed music could provide a different future. He was a songwriter who experienced uncertainty before finding success. He was a husband whose marriage collapsed, a father, a pilot, an environmentalist, a humanitarian, a traveler, and an explorer. He was also an imperfect man who eventually confronted some of his own worst decisions. His life contained contradictions that could never be completely captured by one song or one public image. Perhaps that is exactly why his music continues to connect with Americans. Denver's songs were not really only about mountains or roads. They were about the human desire to find peace in a complicated world. They were about stepping away from the noise and remembering what matters: family, love, nature, freedom, and the hope that somewhere there is a place where you belong. For someone whose childhood was shaped by constant movement, the idea of home became one of the strongest themes he could express. Through music, he gave millions of people a version of home they could carry with them wherever they went. John Denver's journey was ultimately a story of reinvention. Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. became John Denver. The restless military child became a professional musician. The folk performer became a crossover superstar. The singer of peaceful songs became an environmental and humanitarian activist. The celebrity who appeared comfortable in front of millions of people spent much of his private life searching for balance and meaning. And the man who struggled to find a permanent home eventually created one through his music, a place existing in the imagination of anyone who hears his songs. Today, the world John Denver knew is almost unrecognizable. The music industry has transformed, technology has changed how people listen, and generations have grown up without experiencing the original cultural moment that made him famous. Yet his music refuses to disappear. Country Roads is still sung by crowds. Rocky Mountain High remains closely tied to Colorado. Annie's Song continues to be remembered as a classic love song. His recordings still appear on playlists, during road trips, at family gatherings, and in moments when people want to escape the noise of everyday life. In the end, John Denver's legacy may not be measured only by records, awards, or chart success. It may be measured by the feeling that arrives when his voice begins. Within seconds, a listener can imagine a winding highway, a quiet mountain morning, a family waiting at home, or a wide-open American landscape untouched by the pressures of modern life. Denver spent his career trying to capture that feeling, and somehow he succeeded. His life was not perfect, and it was never as simple as the wholesome image America once saw on television. There were triumphs and failures, love and heartbreak, ambition and regret, public success and private struggle. But that complexity is precisely what makes his story worth remembering. Behind the gentle voice was a man who spent his life searching for freedom, connection, purpose, and a place he could truly call home. He never found a life without contradictions. What he did find was a way to turn those contradictions into music. And perhaps that is why, decades after his death, John Denver still feels strangely present. When the opening notes of Take Me Home, Country Roads begin, listeners do not simply hear an old song. They hear the idea of home. When Rocky Mountain High plays, they imagine mountains and open skies. When Annie's Song fills a room, they hear a moment of love preserved forever, even though the relationship behind it eventually changed. His songs captured moments that became larger than the man himself. John Denver spent his life searching for a place where he belonged. In the end, he found it in the hearts and memories of millions of listeners. The child who grew up moving from one place to another eventually created a permanent home through music. Every time those familiar melodies return, the journey begins again, down a country road, through the mountains, beneath an open sky, and toward the feeling John Denver spent his entire life trying to describe, the feeling of finally coming home.